Leave me. Save yourself. That's an order. He was bleeding out on a frozen mountain road, 250 pounds of leather and muscle, a man who had survived knife fights, prison yards, and 1,000 miles of open highway, and he was begging a 20-year-old girl to abandon him. She looked him dead in the eye. My father didn't raise me to walk away from dying men, so shut up and hold on to me. And she picked him up. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Emily Carter turned 20 years old, she woke up alone. Not the kind of alone that feels temporary. Not the kind of alone where you know someone is coming home later, where there's a phone call you're waiting for, where the silence is just a pause between conversations. This was the permanent kind. The kind that settles into the walls of a house and makes the whole place feel smaller every single day. She lay in the same narrow bed she'd slept in since she was 6 years old, staring at the same water stain on the ceiling that her mother had always promised to fix. Outside, the Montana wind was doing what Montana wind does in late November. It wasn't asking permission. It wasn't being gentle. And it absolutely did not care that a young woman was lying in a cold house trying to remember what it felt like to have a family. Emily sat up, pulled on 2 sweaters instead of 1 because the heating system had been struggling for the past 3 weeks, and she hadn't had the money to call someone out to look at it. She padded across the wooden floorboards, the ones her father had laid himself, plank by plank, the summer she was 8, and she put the kettle on. That was her birthday celebration. A kettle, a cracked mug, and silence so deep she could hear the trees outside moving. She didn't feel sorry for herself. That's what people who knew Emily always said about her later when they were trying to explain who she was. They'd shake their heads and say, "You have to understand, Emily didn't waste time feeling sorry for herself. She was practical, she was clear-eyed. She got up every morning and she did what needed to be done because that was exactly what her father had taught her, and Robert Carter's lessons had a way of sticking." But on this particular morning, with the kettle starting to whistle and the wind rattling the kitchen window in its frame, Emily Carter allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of grief. 30 seconds to think about her mother, 30 seconds to think about her father, 30 seconds to acknowledge that 20 years old was supposed to feel like something, and instead it felt like standing in the middle of an empty field with no map and no compass, and the sky turning dark. Then the 30 seconds ended. She poured her coffee. She picked up the notepad she kept on the kitchen counter, where she wrote down everything that needed fixing, everything that needed paying, everything that was quietly falling apart around her. The list was longer than it had been last week. That was always the way with old cabins. You fixed one thing and something else decided it was its turn to fail. The roof in the northwest corner had started leaking again after the last storm. The back generator needed a new part she couldn't afford yet. The wood pile outside had gotten low faster than she'd expected, and winter had barely started. She studied the list the way a general studies a battlefield. Not panicking, not despairing, just looking at the situation with clearing eyes and figuring out where to begin. What Emily didn't write on the list, because some things you don't write down, some things you just carry, was the other problem. The one that had been building for 2 years, the one that arrived in the form of a man named Gerald Briggs. Gerald Briggs was 54 years old and owned more of Cutters Creek, Montana than any one person had a right to. He owned the lumber supply. He owned 2 of the 3 motels on the main road. He owned parcels of land scattered across the valley like chess pieces he'd spent decades placing just right. He wore expensive boots and drove a truck that cost more than Emily's entire cabin. And he had a way of smiling that made people feel like they owed him something, even when they'd never asked him for a single thing. He wanted the Carter land. He'd wanted it for 2 years, ever since Emily's mother passed and left her as the sole surviving member of a family that had worked this particular stretch of Montana ground for 3 generations. Emily understood why. The Carter property sat right at the base of a ridge that Briggs had been trying to develop a resort concept, someone in town had said, or maybe a private hunting preserve. The details shifted depending on who was telling the story. What didn't shift was the number Briggs had started with when he first knocked on Emily's door, and the way that number had never gone up, no matter how many times he came back. He started at $40,000. The land was worth 4 times that at minimum. Emily had said no politely the first time, the second time, the 5th time, The offers had stopped being friendly around visit number 7. They'd stopped even pretending to be friendly around visit number 9. Now Gerald Briggs sent letters from a lawyer's office in Billings. Letters full of words like encroachment and delinquent and outstanding assessment words designed to make a 20-year-old woman feel like the ground she was standing on was already slipping away. She'd read every single one of those letters. She'd also put every single one of them in a folder in the cabinet in her father's old office, right next to the deed to the property, the original survey maps in the notebook where Robert Carter had written down every improvement he'd made to the land over 37 years. She wasn't giving it up. She wasn't going to give it up. But she was running out of room to breathe, and that was the truth. She sat with every morning while she drank her coffee and looked at her list and tried to figure out which problem to attack first. Robert Carter had died 18 months ago, a heart attack. Quick and quiet, which was how Robert Carter had done most things. He'd been out on the property checking the fence line along the east pasture, which was something he'd done every morning for 30 years, as though the fence line might have gone somewhere overnight if he didn't keep an eye on it. When he didn't come back for lunch, Emily had gone looking for him. She'd found him face down in the grass about 200 yards from the old birch tree he'd planted the year she was born. She'd sat with him for a long time before she called anyone. She hadn't cried. That came later in private, the way most things came for Emily, processed quietly in the dark, with no audience. What she'd felt in that field was something harder to name. A shift. The sensation of a door closing behind you that you knew you'd never be able to open again. Her mother had been gone 4 years by then. Cancer, low and ugly, the way cancer usually is, eating up Margaret Carter piece by piece over 18 months, until there was very little left of the woman who had read Emily bedtime stories and taught her to bake bread and braided her hair every Sunday morning before church. So Emily knew how to lose people. She'd had practice. What she hadn't had practice with was being completely alone. There were people in Cutter's Creek who were kind. There was Mrs. Hensley at the general store who always asked how things were going and meant it. There was old Pete Garfield, who had been her father's friend and still checked in every few weeks, though he was in his 70s himself and couldn't do much more than check in. There were neighbors, technically, though the nearest one was 4 miles away. But kind was different from present. Kind was different from family. Emily had learned to function without family. She'd learned to seal up the parts of herself that ached for it and keep moving, because stopping was not an option, because the cabin didn't care whether she was grieving, because the list on the kitchen counter kept growing whether she paid attention to it or not. What she hadn't fully reckoned with was what happens to a person when they've been alone long enough. What happens to the edges, how they get harder without you noticing. How you stop expecting people to show up for you and start treating that expectation itself as a weakness you need to eliminate. Emily, on the morning of her 20th birthday, was a girl who had gotten very good at needing nothing and no one. She would spend the rest of her life grateful that she hadn't gotten good enough. Bye. The afternoon of November 14th started out ordinary. She had a list of things to do in town: drop off a payment at the property tax office, pick up the new blade for the handsaw she'd ordered 3 weeks ago, stop at Hensley's for flour and kerosene. Practical things, the kind of errands that take up a Tuesday afternoon and don't announce themselves as the day that will divide your life into before and after. She drove the old blue pickup into Cutter's Creek, did what she needed to do, and started back. She took the long way home. This was something she did sometimes more often than she could explain rationally. There was a back road that wound up through the trees along the base of the ridgeline, a road that barely deserved the name, more of a maintained trail, really the kind of route that the county had paved approximately 40 years ago and then largely forgotten about. But it went past the overlook where her father used to take her on Sunday afternoons, the place where you could see 3 valleys at once on a clear day, and sometimes Emily drove out there just to feel like she was somewhere her father had also been. Grief is strange like that. It makes you do things that don't make sense to anyone else. It makes you drive 15 extra minutes on a freezing Tuesday in November just to pass a rock formation that a dead man loved. She was about 2 miles past the overlook, the trees pressing close on both sides of the road, the light already starting to go the way it does in Montana in November, fast and without warning, like someone turning off a switch, when she heard it. The sound was enormous. It wasn't just a crash, it was a cascade of sounds. The initial impact, which hit like a thunderclap somewhere in the trees to her left, followed immediately by the grinding shriek of metal skidding across pavement, followed by a crashing of underbrush, followed by silence. The kind of silence that comes after something terrible. Emily stopped the truck. She sat for exactly 2 seconds, both hands still on the wheel, and she thought about Gerald Briggs's lawyers and her leaking roof and her dwindling woodpile and every other problem she was already carrying. Then she turned off the engine and got out. She found him 30 yards off the road. The motorcycle had left the pavement and gone down a shallow embankment, cutting a path through the brush before stopping against a stand of young aspens. The machine itself was on its side, and it was bad. She could see that even before she registered anything else. The front fork was folded almost in half. The tank had ruptured. Fluid was pooling dark and spreading in the frozen dirt. The man was beside the bike. He'd been thrown clear, which was the only reason he was still alive. Though alive was doing some generous work in that sentence. He was on his back, partially propped against the embankment, and he was big. She registered that immediately, the way you register a physical fact that's going to be relevant. Big shoulders, big hands, the weathered build of a man who had spent decades outdoors. He was wearing a black leather vest over a dark flannel jacket, and across the back of that vest was a patch she recognized even from a distance. She'd seen the patch in photographs. Everyone in Montana had seen it in photographs. The skull, the wings, Hell's Angels. Emily Carter stopped walking. Not for long, 2 seconds, maybe 3. Later, when people asked her what went through her head, in that moment she always gave the same answer: nothing useful. Not fear exactly. Not calculation. Nothing coherent at all, really. Just the image of her father standing in the kitchen of this same cabin 20-something years ago, explaining something to a small girl who was asking why he'd stopped to help a stranger whose car had broken down on a highway when they were already running late. When someone is in trouble, you don't stop to ask who they are. You ask what you can do. She kept walking. His eyes were open when she reached him. Dark eyes, unfocused, blinking slowly at the darkening sky with the particular expression of a person who is trying very hard to stay present and losing the argument. There was blood. She clocked it fast, the way she'd learned to assess things, fast running down the left side of his face from a gash above his temple, soaking through the left shoulder of his jacket, which told her the shoulder had taken impact. His left leg was at an angle that made her jaw tighten involuntarily. But he was breathing, conscious, fighting. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Hey," she said. "Hey, look at me. Right here." His eyes moved, found her face, tried to focus. "Who the hell?" His voice came out wrong, rough and thin and surprised. "My name is Emily Carter," she said. "I heard the crash. I'm going to help you. What's your name?" He stared at her for a moment. She watched him, deciding whether this was real. "Jack," he said finally. "Jack Callahan." "Okay, Jack, I need to check how bad this is. Can you tell me what hurts most?" Something crossed his face that might have been a laugh if he'd had the energy for it. "Faster to tell you what doesn't. Start with the shoulder." He grimaced as she carefully moved the jacket collar aside. The shoulder was bad. She didn't know enough to diagnose it, but she knew enough to know that the way the joint sat was wrong, and the amount of blood soaking the fabric was not a small injury amount of blood. "Jack, I don't have cell service out here. How far back did you pass a signal?" "Mile, maybe 2. His breathing was becoming more effortful. "Town's about 4 miles north. My truck is on the road. Can you—" "I'm not going to be able to walk to your truck." He said it flatly, not dramatically. A man assessing a tactical situation. "I might be able to move if you help me, but He stopped, breathed. "I don't know how far." She looked at the embankment, looked at him, looked at the growing dark around the trees. The temperature had dropped while she'd been down here. She could feel it, and now the air was getting that particular Montana winter quality, where it starts to bite through layers and the ground gets harder under your knees. "How long ago did you come off the bike?" "I don't know, it was—" He tried to look around and immediately regretted it going still. "It was still light when I went down." She'd been driving for 20 minutes since the light started to go. That meant he'd been down here at minimum 15, probably 20 minutes, possibly longer, in dropping temperatures, losing blood. Emily sat back on her heels and thought, not panicking. That was the first thing. Panic was the enemy of clear thinking, and she needed to think clearly right now, more than she had needed anything in a very long time. She had her truck, but she couldn't get the truck down this embankment, and she couldn't get this man up the embankment without help. She had a basic first aid kit in the truck's glove box. She always kept one, her father's habit, which meant she had gauze, medical tape, a foil emergency blanket, and a small bottle of antiseptic. She had her jacket and 2 layers underneath. She had a flashlight. She had no phone signal. And she had a 250-pound man bleeding into the frozen dirt. Jack, she said, I'm going to go get some things from my truck. I'll be back in 3 minutes. You don't need to. 3 minutes, she said, and she stood up and moved. Of course, she went up that embankment faster than she'd gone down it. She hit the road, crossed to the truck, and had the glove box open in seconds. First aid kit, emergency blanket, the scarf from the back seat, the spare flannel she kept behind the driver's seat, for exactly the reason that Montana winters were not predictable. She was back at his side in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. She worked quickly. The head wound first, she'd learned the basics from a wilderness first aid pamphlet she'd read twice, which was not a lot of training, but was more than nothing. Pressure on the temple. Direct, firm, sustained. While she held it, she talked to him, not because she had read that you should keep people talking, though she had read that, but because she needed him conscious and his eyes were doing something she didn't like. That slow drift, the lids going heavy. Hey, Jack, stay with me. I'm here. Where are you from? A pause. Originally Ohio. How long have you been riding it? Since I was 16. He paused again. Long time. What brought you out on this road today? Took a wrong turn back around Millhaven. His voice was a little steadier. Talking was helping. Was supposed to be on 93, but I went... He stopped. You're keeping me talking. Yes. Smart. Thank you. Now hold this. She placed his right hand over the gauze at his temple. Don't move it. She moved to the shoulder next. The jacket had to come partly off, not fully, because moving the arm that much was going to cause him serious pain and possibly additional damage, but enough to get the gauze underneath and wrapped. She did it carefully, talking steadily as she worked, and Jack Callahan made exactly one sound during the process, a short, controlled exhale through clenched teeth that told her it had hurt very badly and he had chosen not to say so. You do this before? He asked when she was securing the wrap. First aid read about it, never done it for real. Hell of a first time. Yeah, she sat back, assessed. The bleeding was slowing at the temple. The shoulder was wrapped. The leg, she'd looked at the leg, and the angle was bad enough that she wasn't going to try to touch it. That needed a real doctor, a real facility, things she could not provide on the side of a mountain. Jack, here's the situation. I need to be honest with you. Go ahead. I can't go for help and leave you here. Temperature is dropping too fast. By the time I got to a signal and help got back here, you'd be in hypothermia territory and combined with the blood loss. She kept her voice level. I don't like those odds. He was quiet for a moment. What are you saying? I'm saying I think I need to get you to my truck, which means I need to get you up that embankment. Another silence. She watched him do the math, his size, her size, the embankment, the leg. That's not possible, he said. Tell me why. Because I weigh 250 and you weigh, what, 120? 115, she said, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I need you to work with me, because if you fight me or go passive on me, we're both in trouble. Can you do that? Jack Callahan looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze without flinching. You're serious, he said. Very. He let out a slow breath. Who are you? I told you, Emily Carter. You're a kid. I'm 20 years old today, actually. Something shifted in his expression, something that under other circumstances might have been the beginning of a smile. Happy birthday, he said. Thank you. Now let's go. She wrapped the emergency blanket around his torso, first tucking it under him to insulate from the ground, then tied the spare flannel around his waist and knotted it into a makeshift harness, something to grab onto, something to distribute the pull across his body rather than just his injured shoulder. Getting him upright took 7 minutes. 7 minutes of adjusting and repositioning and communicating in short, clear sentences about where to put weight and when to push and where to grip. 7 minutes during which Jack Callahan went silent in a way that told her the pain was significant and he was spending every available resource managing it. 7 minutes during which Emily's arms shook and her back screamed, and she thought about her father laying floorboards and her mother braiding her hair and every hard thing she had ever done that she had gotten through by simply refusing to stop. I was on his feet, sort of, one foot. The bad leg could take no weight at all. Okay, she said, breathing hard. I'm going to be on your right side. You're going to put your right arm around my shoulders, not the injured shoulder, the right one. And you're going to take as much of your own weight as you can. Can you do that? Yeah. Tell me the truth. I can do it. Good. Here we go. The embankment was 30 feet of frozen, uneven ground. They took it at about the speed of a snail having second thoughts. Every step required negotiation, where the ground was solid, where it was loose, how to angle her body to compensate for his, how to move his dead leg without letting it drag and cause him to go down. 3 times he nearly fell. 3 times she caught him. The third time was the worst. He went sideways. Suddenly a full body dropped to the right, and she took all of it, 250 pounds, lurching against a 20-year-old girl's frame, and she went down to one knee, but she did not go all the way down. She did not let him fall. I've got you, she said through teeth that were clenched against the weight. I've got you. He was breathing in short, hard bursts. She could hear the pain in it. Leave me, he said. Emily, listen to me. Leave me here. Go get help. Stop. I'm serious. You can't. Jack. She shifted her grip, adjusted her stance, pulled herself upright with him leaning against her. My father would never forgive me if I left someone behind, and I'm not ready to disappoint my father yet. So, we keep moving. He went quiet. For the rest of the embankment climb, he didn't tell her to leave him again. They reached the truck. Getting him into the passenger seat was its own battle. Another 10 minutes of work, more pain, more of that controlled silence from Jack that she was coming to understand as his way of managing the unbearable. She got the seat reclined as far as it would go and piled her jacket over him and started the engine with hands that were so cold they barely worked. Service station, she said as much to herself as to him. The one on the 73 junction, that's the closest phone. How far? 3 miles, maybe a little more. He was quiet for a moment, then drive fast. That's the plan. She pulled onto the road. The radio came on when the truck started an old country station, the kind that plays the same 40 songs on rotation, and something about the sheer normalcy of it. A tinny guitar filling a cab where a man was bleeding onto her seat made her jaw tighten in a way she didn't expect. Hey, Jack said. She glanced at him. His eyes were open, watching her. What? You keep going quiet. Talk to me. The corner of her mouth moved. You're the one who needed talking to earlier. Now it's your turn. You look like you're somewhere else. She thought about that. I'm just thinking about the road. No, you're not. She drove. The trees went past. The last of the light was gone now, and the headlights carved 2 yellow tunnels into the dark. This is my birthday, she said finally. You mentioned. I was alone this morning, just me and a list of things falling apart. She paused. I took this road because it goes past a place my father liked. I haven't talked to anyone all day. Jack was quiet for a moment. Well, he said slowly, you're talking now. She didn't answer that, but something shifted in her chest, something very small and very old, like a window she'd forgotten about cracking open an inch. She drove. The service station lights appeared around a bend, orange and yellow and beautiful against the dark. Emily Carter exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. She pulled in and had the door open before the truck stopped moving, was already calling for help. Already saying the words clearly and fast. Injured man, head wound, shoulder, possible leg fracture. Blood loss, and the attendant at the desk was already reaching for the phone, already dialing. She went back to the truck, opened the passenger door. Jack was still conscious. Barely. Still conscious and looking at her with an expression she didn't have a word for. Help is coming, she said. You're going to be okay. He moved at his right hand, gripped her wrist. Not hard, he didn't have the strength for hard, but firm. Present. Emily Carter, he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Yeah, when I get out of the hospital. He stopped, breathed. I'm going to find out more about you. She looked at him for a moment. A man she'd known for less than an hour. A man whose name was on a patch her whole town would have told her to be afraid of. You'd better, she said. The ambulance siren started somewhere in the distance, getting closer. Emily Carter stood in the cold outside a mountain service station on her 20th birthday with blood on her jacket and her hands still shaking from the cold, and she thought about her father and his fence line and the birch tree he'd planted the year she was born. She thought he would have said, "You did the right thing." And then she thought, "I know, Dad. I know." The sirens got louder. The night pressed in close around the yellow lights. And a girl who had spent her birthday alone stood at the edge of something she couldn't yet see, something that was about to come roaring toward her, like 500 motorcycles at full throttle, something that would change everything she thought she knew about being alone in the world. She just didn't know it yet. For now, she stood in the dark, and she listened to the sirens getting closer, and she pressed her cold hands together, and she waited. The ambulance took Jack Callahan away at 6:47 in the evening. Emily watched the red lights disappear around the bend in the road, and then there was nothing left but the sound of the service station's generator humming, and a man named Daryl, the night attendant, standing behind her with a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for. "Here," he said. "You look like you need it." She took it without looking at him. Her hands had stopped shaking about 5 minutes ago, which she took as a good sign, and she was still standing, which she took as an even better one. The coffee was bad, old, and burnt, and barely warm, and it was the best thing she had tasted in a long time. "You know him?" Daryl asked. He was in his 50s, heavy-set, with the cautious voice of a man who had learned not to ask too many questions, but couldn't quite stop himself this time. "No," Emily said. "Hell's Angels patch on his vest." "I noticed." Daryl was quiet for a moment. "You brought him in anyway." She looked at him then. He had the expression of a man trying to work out a math problem that kept coming up with an answer he didn't expect. "He was bleeding out on the side of the mountain," Emily said simply. "What was I supposed to do?" Daryl had no answer for that. She drove home alone. The cabin felt different when she walked in. She couldn't have explained why not, precisely, but the silence that met her at the door was a different quality of silence than the one she'd left that morning. It was the silence after something had shifted. The way a room feels different after someone has been in it, even when they're gone. She sat down at the kitchen table, still wearing her jacket, the one with Jack Callahan's blood drying dark on the left sleeve, and she put her hands flat on the table and she sat there for a while. Her birthday, she thought. Some birthday. Then she laughed, a small, surprise sound alone in her kitchen at 7 in the evening. Because it was absurd, genuinely absurd, that the first real human interaction she'd had on her 20th birthday was dragging a bleeding Hell's Angel up an embankment in the dark. Her father would have loved that story. She took off the jacket, went to bed, slept harder than she had in months. She didn't think about banging his hand the next day. She had the roof to deal with. The northwest corner had leaked again overnight, just enough to soak through the insulation and leave a damp spot on the ceiling of the back bedroom. And she spent most of the morning up on the roof herself with a bucket of patching compound and the grim determination of someone who could not afford to hire this out. She was 3 hours in when Pete Garfield's old green pickup came up the drive. She watched him from the roof, not moving. Pete got out slowly, the way Pete did everything these days, and stood in the drive, shielding his eyes against the sky. "Emily Carter," he called up. "What in the hell are you doing on that roof? What does it look like?" "Looks like you're trying to give an old man a heart attack." "Come back in an hour, Pete. I'm almost done." He waited in the drive instead, sitting on the tailgate of his truck, and when she climbed down, he had a thermos of actual good coffee and the expression of a man who had something to say. "Heard about last night," he said, handing her the coffee. She wasn't surprised. This was Cutter's Creek. News moved through the valley like water. "Daryl talks," she asked. "Daryl tells his wife tells the women at the church, and the women at the church tell everyone else." He paused. "You all right?" "I'm fine." "Hell's Angels, man," they said. He needed help. Pete studied her for a long moment. He had known her since she was born. He had known her father since they were both young men, had been at Robert Carter's funeral, standing straight and quiet in the back pew, because Pete Garfield was the kind of man who always stood in the back and never made a scene. He looked at her now the way he sometimes looked at things he recognized. "Your father's girl," he said quietly. Just that, not a question. Emily handed him back the thermos. "How'd you hear it got around so fast?" "Because Gerald Briggs heard it too." She went still. Pete said it without drama, without leading up to it, just placed the information down between them like a tool he wanted her to look at. Gerald Briggs had heard about the Hells Angels man, about who had brought him in. "What did he say?" she asked. "Nothing yet, but his lawyer called the county assessor's office this morning." "About what?" "About a disputed boundary survey on the east end of your property." Pete's voice was even. "Careful. It's the third different angle he's tried in 2 years, Em. I just want you to know he's moving again. She stood very still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Gerald Briggs, she thought. The timing was either a coincidence or it wasn't, and Emily Carter had never had much patience for coincidences. He thinks last night distracted me, she said. Probably. It didn't. I know that, Pete said. I just wanted you to know he was moving. She nodded, filed it up her bucket of patching compound, and went back to work. But she thought about it for the rest of the afternoon, turning it over the way you turn over a rock you don't quite trust. Gerald Briggs calling the assessor's office. A disputed boundary. The east end of the property, which was exactly the parcel that sat at the base of the ridge he'd been eyeing for 2 years. She thought he's been patient. 2 years of patience. And now he's tired of being patient. She thought, so am I. Yeah. 4 days passed. On the fifth day, a man named Roy Decker showed up at her door. Roy was maybe 40, lean and weathered, wearing a leather vest that Emily recognized even before she had time to think about recognizing it. The patch was on the front, this time smaller, a chapter designation below the main emblem. He had dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had argued with several blunt objects over the years, and he was holding his hat in his hands in a way that struck her as unexpectedly formal. She stood in the doorway without opening the door all the way. Ms. Carter, he said. That's right. My name is Roy Decker. I ride with the chapter out of Billings. He stopped. Started again like a man who had rehearsed something and found it inadequate now that he was actually standing here. Jack Callahan is a brother of ours. We heard what you did. Emily said nothing. I wanted to come see for myself, Roy said. And I wanted to say from all of us, thank you. The words landed with the weight she hadn't expected. Simple words, plain ones. She'd heard thank you thousands of times in her life, and it had never hit her quite like that. Maybe because Roy Decker said it the way a man says something he means down to the bone, no decoration, no performance. How is he, she asked. Jack. Alive, Roy said, which he wouldn't be, the doctors said, if you'd gotten there 20 minutes later. She absorbed that. She'd suspected it on the mountain. Hearing it stated as fact by someone else was different. He lost a lot of blood, Roy continued. Shoulder needed surgery. Leg's going to take time. But he's Jack. You can't keep Jack down. I'm glad, she said and meant it. Roy was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. Then he said, he told us about the birthday. She blinked. That it was your birthday, that you were alone, that you calm. He stopped, cleared his throat. He said you told him your father would never forgive you if you left someone behind. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. That meant something to us, Roy said. That means it means something when someone does something like that with no angle, no reason, just because it was right. He paused. I know you don't know us. I know what people think when they see the patch. I don't make decisions based on what people think, Emily said. Roy looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression changed, adjusted the way a calculation changes when you get new information. No, he said. I don't expect you do. He asked if he could come in for coffee. She said yes. He stayed for an hour and a half. He didn't ask a lot of questions, which she appreciated. He listened more than he talked, which she appreciated even more. At some point, she found herself telling him about the roof and the generator and the list on the kitchen counter, not complaining, just explaining the shape of things. And Roy listened with the careful attention of a man who is gathering information for a reason, but doesn't want you to know it yet. When he got up to leave, he said, Jack wants to see you when he's out of the hospital. When he's on his feet enough to come out here. He paused. If that's all right with you. It's all right, she said. He nodded, put his hat back on, stopped at the door. Ms. Carter, one more thing. He said it with his back still half turned, like a man dropping something important at the very end of a conversation on purpose. Has anyone been giving you trouble out here? Anyone been putting pressure on you about this property? She looked at him. Why do you ask? Because Jack told me to ask, Roy said, and Jack doesn't ask things without a reason. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and was doing things to the pine trees that made them sound restless. She thought about the folder in her father's office, the letters from the lawyer in Billings, the call to the county assessor that Pete Garfield had mentioned. She thought, tell him or don't tell him. She thought, you don't know these people. She thought you didn't know Jack Callahan either, and you carried him 3 miles. There's a man named Gerald Briggs, she said. He's been trying to take my land for 2 years. Roy's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness changed. Tell me about Gerald Briggs, he said and sat back down. She told him everything. Not because she had decided to trust him entirely, and not because she was desperate enough to take help from anyone who offered. She told him because she was 20 years old, and she had been carrying this alone for 2 years, and it needed to be said out loud to another human being for the first time, all of it, not just the edges of it. She told him about the first knock on the door, the $40,000 offer, the way Briggs had stood in her kitchen and looked around at everything her family had built, like he was already calculating how to tear it down and start over. She told him about the escalating visits, the shifting offers, the letters from the lawyers. She told him about the phone call she'd received 3 months ago, a voice she didn't recognize, male middle-aged, telling her in very measured tones that accidents happen to people who are stubborn, that a young woman alone on a mountain had a lot of ways to get hurt, that maybe it would be worth thinking about whether the land was worth more to her than her safety. She'd never told anyone about that call. Not Pete, not the sheriff's office, because she'd picked up the phone to call the sheriff's office and then put it back down because she'd done the math on a young woman with no money and no connections going up against a man who had spent 20 years buying this county's goodwill, and she didn't love her odds. Roy Decker sat at her kitchen table and listened to all of it. His jaw got harder as she talked, which she noticed, but he didn't interrupt, and he didn't react in ways that seemed performative. He just listened. When she was done, there was a silence. Then Roy said very quietly, he made a threat. Yes. On the phone, she asked Fano. Yes. And you didn't report it. I didn't think it would go anywhere. He was quiet for another moment. Do you still have the number? I tried to call it back. It was a prepaid, disconnected by the time I tried. Roy nodded slowly. He looked at her hands folded on the table. Then he looked at her face. Emily, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her first name. I need to tell you something about Jack. She waited. Jack Callahan has been writing for 31 years. He's been through things I'm not going to tell you about because they're his to tell. But in 31 years, there are about 5 people alive who Jack would say saved his life. And now there are 6. He paused. Jack doesn't forget his debts, and neither do we. I don't need anything from you, she said. Reflexive, immediate. The way 20 years of being alone will make a person respond to the suggestion of help. I know you don't, Roy said. That's not why we do it. She looked at him. We do it, he said simply, because it's right. She recognized those words. She'd used different ones, but she recognized the shape of them. Jack Callahan got out of the hospital 23 days after Emily had found him on that mountain road. She knew this because Roy called her. Roy had somehow gotten her number. She didn't ask how, and he didn't explain. And he called to let her know that Jack was out, that Jack was home, that Jack was already trying to put weight on the leg his doctors had told him to keep off for another 6 weeks. Classic, Roy said, and there was something in his voice that was both exasperation and deep affection. You tell that man to do something, and he does the opposite on principle. He seemed like that kind of person, Emily said. He's the worst kind, Roy said, and she could hear the smile in it. He wants to come see you. Would next Saturday work? She thought about the roof, which was temporarily patched, the generator, which was limping along, the folder in her father's office, which had gotten a new letter this week, the 4th in 6 months. This one questioning whether Emily had actually lived continuously on the property since inheriting it, a question so transparently manufactured that reading it had made her hands shake with anger. Saturday works, she said. Saturday came, and it was not as it turned out, just Jack. She heard them before she saw them. That was the only way to put it. She was inside when the sound started, a low rumble that she initially thought was weather. A distant roll of something atmospheric, and then it grew and kept growing. Not the way thunder grows, but the way something deliberate grows, something with direction and purpose. She went to the window. The road up to her property was a quarter-mile long, unpaved, running between 2 fence lines through a stand of lodgepole pines. And coming up that road 2 by 2 in a long, unhurried column were motorcycles. Not a few, not a handful, dozens. She stood at the window and she counted, and she stopped counting somewhere around 40 because the column was still emerging from the tree line and she couldn't see the end of it. Her first thought, absurdly, was the drive can't handle this. It's going to tear up the drive. Her second thought was something she couldn't name at all, something that started in her chest and moved outward, a pressure that was not quite what she would have called an emotion, except that her eyes were suddenly doing something she hadn't given them permission to do. She went to the door, opened it, stepped onto the porch. They filed into the open ground in front of the cabin, parking in rows with the practiced ease of people who had done this many times, and there were more than she thought from the window. She counted later and got to 67 before she gave up, and every single one of them was wearing the same patch Jack had been wearing on that mountain road. The engines cut out one by one. The sound died. The silence that followed was enormous. 67 men in the specific silence that comes when that much noise stops all at once. Then the crowd shifted and Jack Callahan came through it. He was on crutches, moving carefully the way a man moves when he is in pain and has made the decision not to show it, except that Emily had spent enough time watching someone manage pain carefully that she could see it anyway. He looked better than the last time she'd seen him, which was not hard to achieve since the last time she'd seen him, he was barely conscious in the passenger seat of her truck. But he also looked like a man who had spent the better part of 3 weeks in a hospital bed, which meant he looked thinner than he was supposed to, and the gash above his temple had healed to a dark scar that would be there for the rest of his life. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. "You could have called," she said. Something moved across his face that she recognized now as his version of a smile. Not the easy kind, not the automatic kind, but the real kind that came from somewhere it had to work to get from. "Where's the fun in that?" he said. She came down the steps. I extended his right hand and she took it, and he held on to it for a moment with the same grip he'd used in the truck that night, the firm, present grip of a man making sure you know he's there. 67 guys, she said. "Is that all of you?" "We had a chapter conflict in Spokane," he said. "Otherwise it would have been more." She looked at him for a moment. "That was a joke." "Half a joke." Roy came up behind him. And behind Roy, the 60-odd others were just standing there, not threatening, not loud, not doing any of the things that a crowd of leather-clad bikers was supposed to do in every story she'd ever heard about leather-clad bikers. Just standing there quiet in the cold November air on the land that had belonged to her family for 3 generations. "Jack," she said. "Yeah. Why are you here, really?" He looked at her, and the half-smile dropped, and what was underneath it was something she hadn't seen on his face before. Something older, something that had been somewhere very dark recently and was still finding its way back. "Roy told me about Briggs," he said. "I figured. You've been dealing with that alone for 2 years. I've been dealing with everything alone for 2 years." Something tightened in his face. "Not anymore." She looked at him, at Roy, at the 67 men standing in her drive. "I don't want trouble," she said. "I need you to understand that. I don't want anyone doing anything that's going to make this worse." "Neither do we," Jack said. "That's not what people say about your—" "I know what people say about us." He said it without defensiveness. "Just fact. We're not here to make trouble, Emily. We're here because you carried me 3 miles on a mountain in the dark on your 20th birthday and asked for nothing. And because the man who's been threatening you thinks you're alone." He paused. "We're here to correct that impression." She stood on the frozen ground of her father's property, and she looked at 67 men in leather vests, and she thought, "Robert Carter, you would not believe this." And then she thought, "Actually, yes, you probably would." "Okay," she said. "Okay," Jack repeated. "Okay." She looked at him directly. "Then come inside. I'll make coffee, and you're going to tell me exactly what you're planning." He glanced back at the crowd behind him. "All of them," he said. "I've got a big porch," she said. And for the first time since November 14th, the day Emily Carter turned 20 years old and stopped being alone, Jack Callahan laughed, full and real and human. The laugh of a man who had been closer to the edge than he'd let himself think about until now, and had made it back. Roy was already heading toward the porch. The men were already moving. And Emily Carter went back inside her cabin to make 68 cups of coffee, which she had absolutely no idea how she was going to manage. But she would manage it the way she managed everything, 1 cup at a time, until it was done. She was, after all, her father's daughter. And Robert Carter's daughter did not walk away from things just because they were hard. She walked toward them, every single time. The coffee situation turned out to be less impossible than Emily had feared, mostly because Roy Decker turned out to be a man who could organize things with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing logistics that polite society didn't ask too many questions about. Within 20 minutes of Emily's invitation, half the men on the porch had produced thermoses from their saddlebags. Someone had driven to Cutter's Creek and come back with 4 boxes of gas station coffee and enough paper cups to serve a small army, and her kitchen had become the temporary headquarters of something she didn't have a name for yet. Jack sat at her kitchen table. He sat the way men sit when they've been told to rest and have decided to interpret that word as loosely as possible. Upright, both hands around a cup, the crutches leaning against the wall beside him, like something he was embarrassed to be associated with. He watched Emily move around the kitchen with the expression of a man who is reassessing something he thought he understood. "You're not what I expected," he said. She didn't stop moving. "What did you expect?" "Roy said you were young. I knew you were young, but—" He stopped. "You carry yourself different." "My father raised me different." "Tell me about him." She paused then, set down the coffee can, turned and looked at Jack Callahan sitting at her father's table in her father's kitchen, and something about the image was so strange and so unexpectedly right that she had to take a moment with it. "Robert Carter," she said. "He was a quiet man. Not the kind of quiet that means nothing's happening, the kind of quiet that means everything happening is going on somewhere you can't see." She paused. "He fixed things, everything, the cabin, the truck, the fences, the neighbor's equipment when it broke down. He had a philosophy about it. He said the world is always coming apart in small ways, and the people who hold it together are the ones who don't wait to be asked." Jack was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like someone I would have liked." "You would have argued with each other constantly," she said, "and you would have respected each other completely." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Because he was stubborn as a mule, and so are you," she said. "I can tell." He laughed. Not the full laugh from the porch, smaller, quieter, private. The kind of laugh that belonged to a kitchen table and not an audience. Roy came through the door, then knocking twice on the frame out of habit. He had a legal pad and a pen which struck Emily as both practical and slightly alarming. "We need to talk about Briggs," Roy said. "I know," Emily said. She poured 3 cups of coffee, set them on the table, and sat down across from Jack. "Tell me what you know." What they knew, it turned out, was more than she expected. Roy set the legal pad on the table, and she could see it had writing on it already. Notes from before they had arrived, which meant they had done homework before showing up on her property, which meant this visit was not as spontaneous as Jack's crutch and porch entrance had made it seem. "Gerald Briggs," Roy said, 54 years old, born in Butte, moved to Cutter's Creek in 1998, built his first business buying distressed properties during the downturn in the early 2000s. He paused. "He's done this before, Emily, not here, but twice before in 2 other counties. Different names on the property, different pressure tactics. Same result." She went very still. "What result?" "Both times the original landowner sold. Both times within 18 months the land was rezoned and developed at a value 5 to 10 times what Briggs paid for it." Roy paused. "One of those landowners was an elderly couple in their 70s. The other was a single mother with 3 kids and outstanding medical debt." Emily felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "He picks people he thinks can't fight back," she said. "Yes. And then he manufactures reasons why they have to sell." "Yes." She looked at the legal pad. "The boundary survey he called in this week is the 3rd manufactured dispute in 2 years," Roy confirmed. "The first was a water rights question in Doi 2 that he eventually dropped. The second was a claim that your father had violated a grazing agreement with adjacent landowners, which turned out to be a document his lawyer had created and backdated." Roy's voice stayed level, but something in it had gone hard. "We found that out from a county clerk named Sheila Prentice, who has apparently been uncomfortable about what she's been asked to file for the past 18 months. Emily stared at him. "A backdated document." "Yes." "That's fraud." "Yes." "How do you know about Sheila Prentice?" Roy looked at her steadily. "We have friends in useful places. Some of them work in county offices. Some of them are lawyers. Some of them are people who owe favors to people who ride with us." He paused. "We don't do illegal things to help you, Emily. I want to be clear about that. But we know how to find information that's sitting right there in the open waiting for someone to pick it up. And we know people who are willing to talk when they've been waiting for the right person to ask." She thought about that for a moment. About Sheila Prentice, a county clerk she'd never met, sitting on knowledge that could expose Gerald Briggs, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Why didn't she go to the sheriff? Emily asked. Because the sheriff went to Briggs's fundraiser last spring, Jack said quietly. She looked at him. His re-election fundraiser, Jack said. Gerald Briggs wrote a check for $5,000. The cold thing moved through her again. Slower this time, more thorough. She had done the math on a young woman with no money going up against a man who had spent 20 years buying this county's goodwill. She had put the phone down instead of calling the sheriff. She had been right, and knowing you were right about something like that was one of the worst feelings she had ever had. Okay, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. So the sheriff is not an option. What is... Roy and Jack exchanged a look across the table. The specific look of two people who have already had this conversation and reached a conclusion. State Attorney General's office, Roy said. A backdated document used in a property dispute is enough to open an investigation if it gets to the right hands. And you know the right hands. We know someone who knows the right hands, Jack said. There's a difference. We're not connected to the state AG's office. But we know a man named Dennis Howell, who is a retired state investigator, who rode with the chapter in Missoula for 6 years before he retired, and who has been looking for a reason to look at Gerald Briggs for reasons that have nothing to do with you. Emily set down her coffee cup. Nothing to do with me, she repeated. What does it have to do with... A beat of silence. 3 years ago, Roy said carefully, a man named Carl Whitmore died in an accident on a piece of property he'd been disputing with Briggs. The official finding was accidental death. Carl Whitmore had been fighting a forced sale. The accident happened 6 weeks before a court date. The kitchen was very quiet. Are you telling me, Emily said slowly, that Gerald Briggs is connected to a man's death? I'm telling you that Dennis Howell thinks so, has thought so for 3 years, and has never been able to get traction because every angle he's tried has run into the same problem. The sheriff, Emily said, the sheriff, the county assessor, 2 members of the planning commission. Roy's voice stayed level. Briggs has spent 20 years making himself necessary to people who make decisions. That's his real business, not property, dependency. Emily sat with that for a long moment. The coffee in her cup had gone cold. Outside, she could hear the murmur of 60-odd men on her porch, a low human sound like a river moving. She thought about Carl Whitmore. She thought about the phone call she'd received 3 months ago. Accidents happen to people who are stubborn. She thought about how she had been so focused on keeping the land that she hadn't let herself fully face what it meant that someone had made that call. What it meant about the kind of man Gerald Briggs actually was underneath the expensive boots in the lawyer's letters. The thread on the phone, she said. The one I told Roy about. Dennis Howell wants to hear about that directly, Jack said. From you, in your own words. He thinks it's the piece he's been missing. He thinks it establishes a pattern of intimidation that goes beyond property dispute into criminal territory, combined with the backdated document in what he already has on Whitmore. Jack stopped. He thinks it could be enough, Emily, if you're willing to tell it. She looked at him. You've been carrying this alone for 2 years, Jack said. You don't have to anymore. I'm not afraid of carrying things, she said. I know you're not. I've got the torn shoulder to prove it. He said it quietly, not as a joke, but as a statement of something true. But there's carrying and there's carrying alone. Those are different things. You don't have to do the second one anymore. She stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the porch where Roy's men were gathered, talking in low voices, drinking gas station coffee in the cold. Her father's land, her mother's kitchen window. 3 generations of people who had worked this ground and intended to go on working it. Gerald Briggs made a call, she said almost to herself. He threatened me. He thought I had no one. He did, Jack said. He was wrong. Yes, Jack said. He was. She turned back to the table. Call Dennis Howell, she said. Set it up. Roy already had his phone out. The meeting with Dennis Howell happened 4 days later in the back room of a diner in Millhaven that was close enough to neutral territory that no one felt watched. Howell was 61, compact with a white mustache and the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades listening to other people and had developed an almost physical patience. He shook Emily's hand with both of his and looked at her in a way that was assessing but not unkind. You're younger than I thought, he said. People keep saying that, she said. He smiled slightly. I mean it as a compliment. It takes more courage to do what you did when you're 20 than when you're 40. I didn't do anything special. You're going to have to let me disagree with you on that. He pulled out a notebook, actual paper, not a tablet. The notebook of a man who did not entirely trust technology, and set it on the table. Let's start from the beginning. Tell me about Gerald Briggs, she told him. All of it again, the same story she'd told Roy in her kitchen, but more of it this time, the details she'd held back with Roy because she hadn't fully trusted him yet. The details she'd been holding back even from herself because looking at them directly required acknowledging how dangerous the situation had actually been. The letter from the lawyer that had used the phrase compelling circumstance in a way she'd understood as a threat before she'd understood it as a legal tactic. The morning she'd come out to find in one of her fence posts on the east end pulled up and left in the middle of the drive, no explanation. Just the fence post lying there like a statement. The car that had sat on the road at the edge of her property for 3 hours one evening, engine running, lights on, not moving until she'd finally gone inside and locked the door. Howell wrote steadily. He didn't interrupt. He asked 2 questions, clarifying questions, the kind that said he already understood the shape of what she was describing and needed specific coordinates. When she finished, he closed the notebook. The fence post, he said. Did you photograph it? No, I just put it back. The car on the road, do you remember the make? Dark blue pickup, newer. I don't know trucks well enough to give you a model. Did you write down any of the dates any of this happened? Not the fence post, not the car. I wrote down the dates of every letter and I have them all filed. Howell nodded. The letters are useful, but they're legal instruments. They've got Briggs's lawyer's fingerprints, not Briggs's. What I need is the phone call. The prepaid was disconnected by the time I tried to call back. I know, but prepaid phones leave traces that feel like they don't. The call was made, which means it hit a tower, which means there's a record of which tower, which means there's a geographic location. He paused. When I have the date and approximate time of that call, I can work backward through records that I have legal access to. It won't be fast, but it'll be thorough. What does thorough look like at the end? Emily asked. Howell looked at her for a moment, deciding how much to say. At the end, he said carefully, if what I find connects to what I already have on Carl Whitmore, and if the backdated document your friends uncovered holds up under examination, and I have someone already looking at it, then we have a criminal case that goes well above what a county sheriff can manage or protect. He paused. State level, possibly federal, depending on how the property documentation falls. Emily said nothing for a moment. Across the table, Roy was very still. Jack, who had insisted on coming despite both Roy and Emily, and his surgeon's advice, was watching Howell with an expression Emily couldn't entirely read. How long, she asked. Weeks, maybe months. I won't lie to you about the timeline. While this is happening, Briggs is still making moves on my property. Yes. The boundary survey he triggered. Can he use that against me in the meantime? Howell shook his head. He can file challenges. His lawyer can make noise. But challenging a survey takes time, and time is something we now have more control over. He looked at her. Are you willing to hold Emily while I work? I've been holding for 2 years. This will be different. This time he'll know something has changed. He'll feel it, and men like Briggs don't always behave predictably when they feel the ground shifting under them. Jack leaned forward at that. She's not alone, he said. It was the same tone he'd used in her kitchen. Not a declaration, a fact. Howell looked at Jack, at Roy, back to Emily. No, he said slowly. I can see that she's not. He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. One more thing, he said, and this is the part where I need you to listen carefully, Emily, because it matters more than anything else I've said today. She met his eyes. When this moves, and it will move, Briggs is going to push back, hard. He's going to use everything he has, his lawyers, his connections, the people in the county who owe him favors. He's going to try to make this about you. Your age, your situation. The fact that you have as he'll frame it outside parties interfering on your behalf. Howell's voice was even and deliberate. He is going to try to make you look unstable or reckless or naive. He is going to suggest that you are being manipulated by people with criminal records. Some of us do have criminal records, Roy said without any particular inflection. Yes, Howell said equally without inflection, and he will use that, which means the story of what actually happened, of what you actually are, and what you actually did needs to be on record before he gets to write his version of it. Emily was very still. What do you mean by on record? I mean, Howell said that there are people, journalists, community members, people in positions of public trust who need to know the truth about Emily Carter before Gerald Briggs decides to introduce his version of her. He paused. Sheila Prentice at the county clerk's office is not the only person who has been uncomfortable. There are others. People who watched Briggs operate for years and said nothing because they saw no opening. You are the opening, Emily. You and the people who showed up for you. She thought about 67 motorcycles coming up her drive. She thought about what Cutter's Creek must have looked like when that column of riders came through town on the way to her property. The people watching from windows. The people standing in parking lots stopping to stare. They saw them come through town, she said slowly. Everyone saw them come through town, Howell said, and everyone is going to have an opinion about what it means. Right now, the story is undefined. Briggs's version will be that a naive young woman has gotten mixed up with dangerous people. Our job is to make sure the true version gets there first. He looked at her. Are you willing to talk to people, tell your story, not just to me? She thought about the 30 seconds she allowed herself on the morning of her birthday. The private kind of grief, the sealed parts of herself. She thought about what it had felt like to say Gerald Briggs has been threatening me for 2 years out loud in her own kitchen for the first time and feel the sentence land somewhere real instead of disappearing into the silence. Some things needed to be said out loud. Yes, she said, I'll talk. Howell nodded, wrote something in his notebook. Outside the diner window, the main street of Millhaven went about its business. People passing cars, moving the ordinary machinery of a small Montana town that had no idea the conversation happening in the back booth would eventually reshape the way it understood itself. It started quietly, not with fanfare, not with announcement. Howell moved the way serious men move when they don't want to telegraph their direction methodically through small channels, building a case the way you build a structure, foundation first. He talked to Sheila Prentice for 3 hours on a Wednesday afternoon and came away with a signed statement about the backdated document that made even Roy go quiet when he heard the contents. Emily talked to a reporter named Sandra Cho from the state paper's regional desk. Sandra had been covering property disputes in rural Montana for 6 years and had the particular hunger of a journalist who has been watching a story develop from a distance and has finally gotten close enough to touch it. She asked good questions. She listened the way Howell listened, with full attention, with the patience of someone who knew that the most important detail was usually the one that came out after the person thought they were finished. The story Sandra was building was not sensational. It was careful and factual, and exactly the kind of story that got into the right hands and stayed there. 3 weeks into Howell's investigation, the thing Emily had been braced for happened. And Gerald Briggs came back. Not himself. His lawyer, a man named Franklin Sousa, who wore suits that cost more than Emily's monthly budget and had a voice trained to sound like reasonableness, even when it was saying unreasonable things, showed up at her door on a Tuesday morning when Jack was not there and Roy was not there. And for one brief, ugly moment, she was 20 years old and alone again, with a man on her porch who represented everything pressing down on her. But she had spent 20 years being her father's daughter. And she had spent the last 3 weeks telling her story out loud to careful people who had helped her understand its shape. She opened the door and she looked at Franklin Sousa and she said, "You can talk to my attorney." Sousa blinked. "Ms. Carter, I don't think you have an attorney." "I do now," she said. "His name is Marcus Webb and he's with the state attorney general's office. I'll give you his number." The color that moved through Franklin Sousa's face in that moment was something Emily would remember for a long time. Not dramatic, just a small involuntary shift, the expression of a man who had built his whole approach on a set of assumptions that had just been revised without warning. "Ms. Carter." "Have a good day, Mr. Sousa," she said, and closed the door. She stood in her kitchen afterward with both hands pressed flat on the counter, breathing. Not because she was afraid, but because the thing you've been bracing for when it finally comes still hits you somewhere, even when you're ready for it. Her phone rang. She picked it up. It was Jack. "How'd it go?" he said. He always called on Tuesday mornings now. She hadn't pointed this out to him. She suspected if she did, he would find a very compelling reason why Tuesdays in particular were a good day to call. "Sousa came," she said. A pause. "You're kidding." 30 minutes ago." "What did you do?" She told him. And she heard on the other end of the line the thing she was coming to recognize as Jack Callahan's truest response to something. Not the full laugh, not the professional stillness, but the short exhale that was somewhere between the two. The sound of a man who was genuinely surprised by the world and glad of it. Marcus Webb, he said. You name-dropped Marcus Webb. I did. Marcus Webb, who you've talked to on the phone twice. He said I could use his name. Emily. He was quieter for a second. You're terrifying. Good, she said. She hung up and stood in her kitchen and looked around at the walls her father had built, the floors he'd laid, the window above the sink where her mother had stood 10,000 mornings looking out at the land. Gerald Briggs had called this place something a young woman would eventually give up. He had been wrong about that from the first moment he knocked on her door, and he was more wrong with every passing day, and the most satisfying thing about that wrongness was that it was entirely her own doing. She poured herself a cup of coffee, made a note on the kitchen pad, call Marcus Webb update on Sousa visit. Then she looked at her list of things to fix, picked the next one, and got to work. Because that was what Robert Carter's daughter did. The world was always coming apart in small ways, and the people who held it together were the ones who didn't wait to be asked. Marcus Webb called on a Thursday morning, and Emily knew from the first half second of silence before he spoke that something had broken open. Webb was 38, a state investigative attorney who had the particular voice of a man who chose every word, the way a surgeon chooses an instrument, precisely with full awareness of what it was going to do. He had taken Emily's case 3 weeks ago, not as a favor, not out of pity, but because Dennis Howell had called him and said 4 words that Marcus Webb had been waiting to hear for 2 years. I have the thread. Emily, he said, are you sitting down? I'm standing in my kitchen, she said. Should I sit? It might be a good idea. She sat. What Webb told her in the next 12 minutes rearranged the landscape of everything she thought she understood about her situation, and she sat at her father's kitchen table and listened without interrupting, because interrupting Marcus Webb when he was building towards something was like stopping a clock mid-chime. You only lost the count. The prepaid phone, he said, had been purchased at a gas station in Billings 14 months ago. The tower records Howell had pulled placed it 4 miles from the Carter property on the evening Emily had received the threat call. The phone had made 6 calls total before being discarded, 2 to a number registered to a property management company in Billings that turned out under examination to be a shell entity with Gerald Briggs's accountant as its registered agent. He called his own shell company from a prepaid phone, Emily said slowly when Webb paused. Twice, which is the kind of mistake people make when they think they're invisible. And the other 4 calls, 3 went to a number we've been looking at in connection with Carl Whitmore's death, Webb said. The 4th went to Franklin Sousa. Emily was very still. Briggs called his own lawyer from the phone he used to threaten me. The same evening, 40 minutes after your call. She absorbed that. Outside, the wind was moving through the pine trees the way it always did in December, that low, relentless push, but she barely heard it. Her whole attention had narrowed to the shape of what Webb was building. Marcus, she said, what does this mean in plain language? In plain language, Webb said, it means that Dennis Howell now has enough to take to the state level without any ambiguity about jurisdiction. The sheriff's relationship with Briggs becomes irrelevant the moment this moves up, which it will. Probably within the week. She pressed her free hand flat on the table, felt the wood her father had sanded and sealed and maintained for 30 years. And my land, the boundary challenge Briggs filed gets suspended the moment a criminal investigation opens. Automatically. His lawyer can't push forward on a civil property dispute while his client is under criminal scrutiny. The court won't allow it. Webb paused. Emily, I need you to understand something. This isn't over. Briggs has money and he has lawyers and he is going to fight. But the fight is now on different ground that favors you. She thought about what Howell had said in the diner. Men like Briggs don't always behave predictably when they feel the ground shifting under them. He's going to know, she said. When the investigation opens, he'll know immediately. Yes. What does he do? That, Webb said carefully, is the part we don't fully control, which is why I need you to not be alone right now. She almost said, I'm used to being alone. She stopped herself. Because it wasn't true anymore in saying it would be owing, and Emily Carter did not lie, not even to herself. I'll make some calls, she said. She called Jack first. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been waiting, though she knew he would deny it if she mentioned it. Howell found the thread on the prepaid, she said. Webb's moving to state level. Silence. Then when, within the week, he said. Another silence different in quality from the first. The sound of a man doing math. I'm calling Roy, Jack said. Jack, Emily. I know you don't need it, he said. I'm calling Roy anyway. There's a difference between needing something and it being the right thing. He paused. I learned that from someone recently. She couldn't argue with that. She didn't try. Fine, she said. Call Roy. She hung up and stood in her kitchen and looked at her list on the counter. The things that needed fixing, the ongoing inventory of a life that kept coming apart in small ways. The list was shorter than it had been a month ago. The roof was properly patched now. The generator had a new part. The woodpile was stacked higher than it had been in 2 years, and she knew whose hands had done that, and she had not entirely made her peace with accepting it, but she was working on it. She picked up the phone again and called Pete Garfield. Pete answered on the fourth ring, the way Pete always answered, slowly, as though the phone's urgency was something he had decided long ago not to be rushed by. He said, what's going on? Something's breaking open with Briggs, she said. I wanted you to know before it becomes public. She heard him go still on the other end, that particular Pete Garfield stillness that meant he was giving something his full attention. Tell me, he said. She told him. Not all of it, not the legal details Webb had given her, but the shape of it, the prepaid phone, the connection to Carl Whitmore, the investigation moving to state level. She heard Pete's breathing change as she talked, not dramatically, just the small adjustment of a man receiving information that confirmed something he had suspected and hoped he was wrong about for a long time. When she finished, Pete was quiet for a moment. Carl Whitmore, he said. You knew him. Knew of him. He had land over in the Barrett Valley. Died 3 years ago. Pete's voice was careful, measured. There were people who said it wasn't right. What happened? But nobody could, he stopped. Nobody could do anything about it. They can now, Emily said. Another silence. Emily, Pete said, and his voice had changed, gone to something softer and more private. Your father, if he could see what you've set in motion here. I didn't set anything in motion, she said immediately. I just told the truth about what was happening. That's all it ever takes, Pete said. That's what nobody understands about truth. It's not dramatic. You don't have to fight for it. You just have to say it out loud and refuse to take it back. She didn't say anything for a moment. The kitchen was very quiet. He would have been proud, Pete said. Robert Carter would have been so damn proud of you. She pressed her lips together, looked at the ceiling, breathed. Thank you, Pete, she said, when she trusted her voice again. Come for dinner this week, he said, both of you. Both of you and that Jack Callahan, Pete said, and she could hear the particular dry warmth of it. I want to meet the man you carried up a mountain. The investigation went public on a Monday. Not in a way Emily had been prepared for, which was to say not quietly. She had imagined something procedural, documents filed, notices, sent the machinery of the state, moving with its usual deliberate pace. She had not imagined Sandra Cho's story running in the state paper's Monday edition above the fold, with a headline that named Gerald Briggs directly, and a secondary headline that included the words, intimidation fraud, impossible connection to 2021 death. She found out because Jack called her at 7 in the morning. Have you seen it? He said. Seen what? Sandra Cho's piece. Emily went to her laptop, found the article. Read the first 3 paragraphs standing at the kitchen counter in her socks and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief, but a strange hollow sensation. Like the moment after a door you've been pushing against for years finally gives way and you stumble forward into the space behind it. The article was careful. Sandra had done what she'd said she would do. She'd built the story on documented facts, on Howell's findings, on Sheila Prentice's signed statement, on the pattern of behavior across 3 counties. Emily appeared in it, but Sandra had written her exactly as Emily had asked to be written, not as a victim, not as a girl who needed saving, but as the person who had brought the information forward. There was 1 paragraph about Jack in the accident on the mountain road. 1 paragraph about the Hells Angels showing up at her property. Sandra had written it plainly without sensationalism and had quoted Roy directly. We came because she did something we weren't expecting from a stranger, and we don't forget things like that. Emily read that paragraph 3 times. You okay? Jack said. He was still on the phone. I'm reading. Take your time. She read to the end, put the laptop down, picked it back up, and read the last paragraph again, which was a quote from Emily herself, something she'd said to Sandra 3 weeks ago in a diner booth that she had half forgotten. She'd said, "My father taught me that when someone is in trouble, you don't stop to ask who they are. You ask what you can do." I think that's just as true for the truth as it is for people. "Jack," she said, "yeah. Is it wrong that I feel I don't know what I feel? Tell me." "I feel like I put something down," she said. "Something I've been carrying so long I didn't notice how heavy it was anymore. And now it's down and I feel lighter but also kind of unsteady. Like I need to relearn how to walk without the weight." A pause on his end, the considered pause that she'd come to recognize as Jack actually thinking, rather than preparing to speak. "That's exactly what it is," he said. "That's the right feeling. That means you did something real." Her phone started going then. Not Jack's her own cell, the other line texts and calls starting to stack up. Mrs. Hensley from the general store. 3 numbers she didn't recognize. Pete Garfield, who had apparently found the article online, which surprised her because she didn't entirely know Pete knew how to find things online. A woman named Karen Whitmore, which was a name Emily had to look at twice because Carl Whitmore had a wife named Karen, and Karen Whitmore was calling Emily Carter on a Monday morning in December. "I have to go," she told Jack. "I know. Call me later." "I will." She answered Karen Whitmore's call. Karen was 63 and had a voice that sounded like it had spent 3 years being very carefully controlled. The voice of a woman who had learned to manage her grief in public because public grief invites public opinions she hadn't asked for. "I read the article," Karen said. "I wanted to call before the day got loud." "I'm glad you did," Emily said. "I never thought—" Karen stopped, started again. "I tried for 2 years after Carl. I talked to the sheriff, I talked to a lawyer, I talked to anyone I could think of, and every road went nowhere, and eventually people started to look at me the way people look at someone who won't let go." Emily sat down. "Nobody would say his name," Karen said. "That was the worst part. Everyone knew or suspected, and nobody would say his name out loud. And then this girl," she stopped. This girl who doesn't even know us, just says it, out loud, in a newspaper." "Mrs. Whitmore," Emily said carefully, "I didn't know about your husband when this started. I was trying to save my own land." "I know that," Karen said. "That's not why I'm calling to thank you. I'm calling to thank you because what you did took courage. Not the big dramatic kind, the small daily kind. That's actually harder, just refusing to be quiet when being quiet would have been so much easier." She paused. Carl had that kind of courage. He never stopped saying what he knew was true, even when it cost him. Emily didn't say anything for a moment. The word cost sat between them, and both women knew what it contained. "I'm going to do everything I can," Emily said finally, "to make sure what happened to your husband is part of this. I need you to know that." "Marcus Webb called me last week," Karen said, "before the article. He said the same thing." A pause. "He told me you were the one who asked him to reach out." Emily had asked Webb, yes, quietly at the end of a call about documents and timelines. "Is there a family, Carl Whitmore's family?" And Webb had said yes, and Emily had said, "Please reach out to them." "It seemed right," Emily said. "It was right," Karen said. "You're your father's daughter, you know." Emily blinked. "You knew my father." "Robert Carter." Everyone in the valley knew Robert Carter. He was the kind of man everyone knew without necessarily having met him. Karen's voice had warmed slightly. "He helped my neighbor put up a fence line one summer. Just showed up and helped. Didn't ask, didn't make a thing of it. Just there and then done." She paused. "I see him in you. I wanted you to know that." Emily set the phone down on the table for a moment, just for a moment, pressed both palms flat and breathed. Then she picked it back up. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. That means more than I can tell you." "Karen," the woman said, "please, we're past formalities, I think." By noon the day had gotten loud. Not loud the way Emily had feared, not confrontational, not dangerous. Loud in the other way, the human way, the way a town gets loud when something shifts and everyone has to figure out where they stand now that the ground has moved. Mrs. Hensley called to say that 3 people had come into her store that morning asking about Emily Carter, and she'd told them exactly who Emily Carter was and what Emily Carter's family had meant to this community for 3 generations, and if anyone had a problem with that, they were welcome to shop somewhere else. Pete Garfield drove out to the cabin in the early afternoon. He didn't call first. He just showed up with a casserole dish covered in foil and the expression of a man who had been waiting for a long time to do something useful and had decided a casserole was the right opening move. "You haven't eaten today," he said when she opened the door. "How do you know?" "Because I know you," he said, "and I know that on days like today, you forget to eat." She let him in. They sat at the kitchen table and ate the casserole, which was chicken and vegetables and something with cheese that Emily couldn't identify but tasted like the specific comfort of someone else having cooked for you. Briggs's lawyer issued a statement, Pete said midway through the meal. He had his phone out reading off the screen with the deliberate care of a man still not entirely at ease with reading off a phone screen. "Says the allegations are baseless. Says it's a coordinated attack orchestrated by, quote, criminal elements with a history of intimidation." "Criminal elements," Emily said. "That's us," said a voice from the doorway, and both Pete and Emily turned to find Roy Decker standing at the open door, which she'd left unlocked out of habit with Jack behind him on his crutches. "You could knock," Emily said. "The door was open," Roy said. "We knocked on the frame. I didn't hear it." "That's because Pete was reading Briggs's statement out loud," Jack said, coming in. He nodded at Pete with the particular male efficiency of two people establishing that they were not going to be awkward about this. "Pete Garfield, I assume." "Jack Callahan," Pete said. He looked at Jack the way he'd looked at people his whole life, direct, unhurried, measuring. "You look better than I expected." "I hear Emily mentioning that she carried a man in bad shape," Jack said. "I try not to take that personally." "You shouldn't. She carries everything. It's a habit." Pete pushed the casserole dish toward the center of the table. "Sit down. There's enough." Jack sat. Roy remained standing with the posture of a man who has somewhere else to be but hasn't left yet. "The statement Briggs released," Roy said. "We expected it." "I know," Emily said. "Webb expected it too. He called me this morning, said it's actually useful when someone releases a public statement denying a criminal investigation before that investigation has formally named them. It sometimes creates," Roy paused, choosing words, "complications for them." "He's scared," Pete said, not a question. "He's scared," Roy confirmed. "Men like Briggs are only comfortable when they control the information. The moment the information is out of their control, they react, and when they react, they make mistakes." He paused. "He's already made one. His lawyer made calls this morning to two members of the County Planning Commission asking them to issue statements in Briggs's support." Emily looked up. "And one of them said yes. The other one called Marcus Webb and told him about the call." Pete made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but came from the same place. "The second commissioner is someone Briggs thought he owned," Roy continued. "Apparently not as fully as he thought." "People surprise you," Emily said. "They do," Roy said, and looked at her in a way that was quieter than his usual manner. "Sometimes all it takes is seeing someone else stand up first, and then they remember they can stand up too." She thought about that, about Sheila Prentice in the signed statement, about the second commissioner making a phone call, about Karen Whitmore reading a Monday morning newspaper and picking up the phone, about all the people who had been sitting on the edges of the truth, waiting for someone to make it safe to say. She had not set out to be that person. She had set out to fix a leaking roof and keep her father's land. But here she was, Joe. 3 days later, Gerald Briggs's lead attorney, not Franklin Sousa, but someone above Sousa, someone flown in from Billings, with the air of a man who, charged by the minute, called Marcus Webb and asked for a meeting. Webb called Emily immediately. "They want to talk," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means they're recalculating their position." Webb's voice was careful, calibrated. "It doesn't mean it's over. Don't think it's over. But it means they see the shape of where this is going and they don't love what they see." "What do they want from the meeting?" "I don't know yet, but I'll find out." He paused. "Emily, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without it knocking you off balance." She braced. "Tell me." "The connection to Carl Whitmore's death, it's real. Dennis Howell has established it to a level that satisfies him, and it will be pursued. But it's a separate track from your case. Whitmore's case will move forward regardless of what happens with your property dispute." A pause. "I'm telling you this because I want to make sure you understand that your case has its own legs. You don't need Whitmore to win your fight, but Whitmore's family gets justice either way." She sat with that for a moment. "Both tracks," she said, "both move forward." "Yes." "Independent." "Yes." "So whatever Briggs offers in a meeting cannot include the Whitmore matter," Webb said. That is not on the table. It never was. That belongs to a different table entirely. She felt something settle in her chest, a kind of clarity that she recognized as the feeling of a line being drawn in exactly the right place. Okay, she said, set the meeting. The meeting happened 4 days later in Webb's borrowed office in Billings, a room with a long table and the kind of corporate neutrality that was designed to make everyone feel equally out of their element. Emily sat on one side, Webb and Howell, Briggs's attorneys, two of them, the flown-in man, whose name was Richard Garner, and a second she didn't learn the name of sat on the other. Gerald Briggs was not there. She noticed that immediately, noticed it and filed it. He had sent lawyers instead of coming himself, which told her something about how this looked from his side of the table. Garner opened with pleasantries so brief they were almost aggressive. Then he put a document on the table. Our client is prepared to withdraw all outstanding property challenges against the Carter parcel, Garner said. Permanently. Additionally, our client is prepared to make a compensatory payment for— Stop, Webb said. He said it quietly, the way you say something when you don't need volume to establish authority. Before you continue, I want to be clear about what is and is not on this table. Garner looked at him. The property challenge withdrawal and any compensatory payment, yes. That's a conversation. Webb's voice was level and absolutely firm. Any suggestion that the criminal investigation is part of this negotiation, no. That is a separate proceeding that neither I nor my client has any authority or intention to influence. Garner's jaw tightened slightly. We understand that. I want to make sure, because if your client came to this table expecting a package deal, criminal matter included, he should have come himself to hear in person that that's not possible. A silence. Our client understands the distinction, Garner said. Good, then let's talk about the property. What happened in the next 90 minutes was not dramatic. That was what Emily found herself thinking afterward, riding back toward Cutter's Creek, in the passenger seat of Webb's car, watching the Montana landscape move past the window. It was not dramatic, it was methodical and occasionally tedious, and involved a great deal of language she had to ask Webb to clarify. And at the end of it, there was a document on the table that neither side had signed yet, but that both sides acknowledged was the shape of what an agreement might eventually look like. The Carter property would not be challenged again. The boundary survey Briggs had filed would be withdrawn. The manufactured documents, the backdated grazing agreement, all of it would be formally acknowledged as invalid. And there would be a compensatory figure that Webb had negotiated from the first number Garner offered to a second number that was significantly more serious. She had not asked for the money. She hadn't wanted the money to be part of it. But Webb had looked at her before the meeting and said, Emily, 2 years of manufactured legal challenges cost you real money. Attorney's fees you would have had to pay, work you couldn't do, sleep you didn't get. Compensation is not charity, it's accountability. She'd let him negotiate it. In the car on the way home, she stared out the window for a long time without talking. You're quiet, Webb said. I'm thinking. Good thoughts or bad thoughts? Both, she said. I'm thinking that Gerald Briggs never once came to a meeting himself. He sent lawyers to knock on my door. He sent a lawyer today. He made a threat call from a prepaid phone. She paused. He's never looked me in the eye. Webb glanced at her. What does that tell you? That he knew the whole time, she said, that what he was doing was wrong. You don't hide behind layers when you believe what you're doing is right. She paused. My father used to say that a man who won't look you in the eye is a man who knows something about himself he doesn't want you to see. Webb was quiet for a moment. Robert Carter said that. He did. He was a wise man. Yes, Emily said. He was. The car went on. The mountains went past. Somewhere ahead was a cabin that belonged to her, that had always belonged to her, that Gerald Briggs's letters and lawyers and midnight phone calls and manufactured documents had never been able to change. That stood exactly where it had always stood, on the ground. Her family had worked for 3 generations, with the northwest roof properly patched and the woodpile full, and 67 motorcycle tire tracks still visible in the drive from a Saturday that felt both very recent and very long ago. The agreement wasn't signed yet. The criminal case was ongoing. Karen Whitmore was waiting for justice that would take longer to arrive and would cost more when it did. None of it was fully resolved, and Emily was old enough to understand that fully resolved was maybe not a thing that real situations ever became. that real life had a way of staying open-ended even after the biggest doors swung shut. But she was going home. To her father's cabin on her father's land in the valley where her father had laid floors and fixed fences and helped neighbors without being asked. She was going home, and she was not going home alone. And that after 2 years and 20 years in a mountain road in the dark on her birthday felt like enough. It felt like exactly enough. The agreement was signed on a Wednesday morning in January, 6 weeks after Emily Carter had sat across from two lawyers who represented a man too ashamed to show his own face. Marcus Webb called her at 9:17. She was on the roof, the northwest corner, again a final round of reinforcement. She'd decided to do herself before the deep freeze set in, and she had to climb down to answer the phone because she had a rule about phones on roofs, a rule her father had invented and she had inherited along with everything else. "It's done," Webb said. Signed, witnessed, filed with the county clerk. She stood at the base of the ladder with one hand still on a rung. "Say that again," she said. "The agreement is filed. The boundary challenge is formally withdrawn. The compensatory payment will clear within 10 business days." Webb's voice had the controlled warmth of a man who had spent a career delivering news that mattered and had never entirely gotten used to the weight of it. "Emily, your land is yours, uncontested, permanently on record." She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the ground under her feet, the ground her grandfather had first broken, the ground her father had walked every morning, the ground she had stood on through 2 years of letters and lawyers and midnight threats, in the specific exhaustion of fighting something that never stopped coming. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. "Don't thank me," he said. "You did this. You held it together long enough for the truth to catch up. That's not a legal skill. That's character." She hung up and stood in the cold for a full minute before going back inside. Then she sat at the kitchen table and she put her face in her hands and she let herself cry. Not the restrained, private grief she'd allowed herself in small doses for 2 years. The real kind, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than sadness. The kind that is actually relief moving through you so fast it has nowhere else to go. She cried for the roof and the generator and the folder of lawyers' letters in her father's office. She cried for the fence post pulled up and left in the drive, and the car that sat outside her property for 3 hours with its engine running. She cried for the 20-year-old girl who had picked up a phone to call the sheriff and then put it back down because she already knew how that story ended. She cried for the man who had laid these floors and would never walk on them again. And for the woman who had stood at that kitchen window 10,000 mornings and who was not there to hear the news. She gave herself 5 minutes. Then she wiped her face, picked up the phone, and called Jack. He answered before the first ring finished. "Webb called you," he said, not a question. He'd been waiting. "It's done," she said. The silence on his end lasted 3 seconds and contained more than most people's paragraphs. She could hear him breathing, could hear the specific quality of a man receiving news he had been willing to fight for, but had not let himself fully believe in until this moment. "Emily," he said. "I know," she said. "Your father's land." "I know, Jack." Another silence. Then quietly, "We need to celebrate." "I'm on a roof." "Get off the roof." "I'm already off the roof." "Good," he said. "Stay off the roof. I'm calling Roy." She almost said, "You don't need to call Roy." She stopped herself again because she was getting better at stopping herself from saying that, at recognizing the reflex for what it was, the armor of someone who had been alone long enough to mistake protection for strength. Roy Decker and 67 men in leather vests had driven up her road in November and changed the geometry of her world, and the least she could do was let them know when the thing they'd come for had been won. "Call Roy," she said, "and Jack, tell him to bring Pete." She heard the smile in Jack's voice. "Yeah, Pete makes a good casserole," she said. "I figure we've earned it." What happened 2 weekends later was not a party exactly. Emily did not throw parties. She didn't have the temperament for them or the experience with them, had grown up in a household where celebration was quiet and personal, where a good day was marked by a good meal, and the acknowledgement usually unspoken that things were okay. But what gathered at her cabin on that Saturday in January was something she didn't have a better word for than family, except that it was a family assembled from pieces that had no obvious reason to fit together and somehow fit completely. Pete Garfield was there. He arrived first because Pete always arrived first to everything, It was a principle of his, the same way showing up early was a principle, the same way the casserole was a principle. He came through the door without knocking, because by now that had become the rule, and he had 3 pies on a tray that he set on the counter without ceremony or explanation. Apple cherry and something I'm calling a Montana special, he said. Don't ask what's in it. I wasn't going to ask, Emily said. Roy came with 6 others from the chapter, not the full 67. Not this time, just the core of the people who had been most involved, the ones who knew the details and had worked the edges and deserved to hear the outcome directly. They arrived with the same precision they always arrived, with bikes parked in the same organized rows. And they came inside and filled the space with that particular energy. She'd come to understand was not intimidating at all. Once you knew them, it was just the energy of people who moved through the world without apology for taking up space. Karen Whitmore came. That was the thing Emily had not entirely expected, though she'd called to invite her. She'd half assumed Karen would decline. The drive was long, the company was unconventional, and Karen Whitmore was a 63-year-old widow from the Barrett Valley who had no particular connection to anyone in this room. But Karen had said yes immediately in the voice of a woman who had spent 3 years in a particular kind of isolation that Emily recognized from the inside, and she arrived at 11:30 with a covered dish in the expression of someone stepping through a door they'd been standing outside for a long time. Emily met her on the porch. Karen Whitmore was smaller than she'd sounded on the phone. White-haired, carefully dressed, with the posture of someone who had decided long ago not to let grief make them smaller. She looked at Emily for a moment before saying anything the way people sometimes do when they've built a picture of someone from a voice in a story and are now comparing it to the real thing. You look like him, Karen said. Your father. I see it around your eyes. Emily held the door open. Come in, she said. I want you to meet some people. Jack arrived last. He always arrived last when there was a group, which Emily had initially taken as a quirk and had come to understand was strategy. He didn't like entering a room and being watched, preferred to be part of something already in motion, rather than the thing that signaled the beginning. The crutches were gone now. He walked with a slight favoring of the left leg that the doctor had told him would probably fade, and that Jack clearly intended to disagree with through sheer force of will, which was exactly how Jack Callahan approached everything his body told him he couldn't do. He came through the door and took in the room Pete at the counter, arguing cheerfully with Roy about something involving pie. Karen Whitmore being shown the photographs on Emily's wall by one of Roy's men who had apparently discovered a talent for making 63-year-old widows feel at ease, the general warm chaos of more people in this kitchen than had been here since Emily's parents were alive. He looked at Emily. She was leaning against the counter with a coffee cup, watching all of it with the expression he'd come to think of as her most private face. Not the capable face, not the composed face, but the one underneath those, the one that appeared when she thought no one was paying close attention. It was the face of someone who had built walls so high and so efficient that they'd forgotten what it felt like to stand somewhere without them, and was now standing in that open place and trying to decide whether it was safe. He crossed the kitchen. Hey, he said. Hey, she said. How are you doing, actually? She looked at him for a moment. I feel like someone rearranged all the furniture while I was sleeping, she said. Everything is better. It's all in better places. But I keep walking into rooms and reaching for things that aren't where I left them. He nodded slowly. That's a good description. I've been practicing. When does it stop feeling like that? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think when you stop expecting the old arrangement to still be there, she said. When the new arrangement starts to feel like the one you remember. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the kitchen noise continued. Pete laughing at something, the smell of the pies warming in the oven, the low rumble of conversation in multiple overlapping registers. Emily, Jack said, I need to tell you something. She looked at him. The day I went down on that road, he stopped. This was not how Jack Callahan usually talked. He was a man of managed silences and strategic brevity and carefully rationed honesty. And what he was attempting right now cost him something visible. I'd been riding alone for 3 weeks, which is not unusual for me. But that particular 3 weeks, I wasn't in a good place. I hadn't been in a good place for a while. She said nothing, gave him the space. When I came off the bike the first 30 seconds, he paused. I'm going to be honest with you because you've earned it. In the first 30 seconds, there was a part of me that thought maybe it was fine. that maybe this was just fine. He met her eyes. And then you showed up. She felt something move through her that she didn't have an immediate name for. You knelt down in the dirt next to a stranger in a Hell's Angels vest, Jack said. And you said, my name is Emily Carter, and I'm going to help you. And I thought, he shook his head slightly. I thought this is real. This is someone real, and I'd been so far inside my own head for so long that I'd forgotten what real felt like. He paused. You didn't just carry me up a mountain, Emily. You carried me back. The kitchen noise continued around them. Nobody was watching. The world was going about its cheerful business, and these two people were having a conversation in the middle of it that had nothing to do with documents or investigations or property lines. Jack, she said, I'm not, he shook his head. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know what that day actually was for me. Because you know what it was for you, a decision, a hard thing you did because your father raised you right. And I want you to know what it was for me. She looked at him for a long moment, at the scar above his temple, at the careful way he was holding himself, the particular posture of a man who has taken the armor off and is aware of the difference. I'm glad you told me, she said. And Jack, I'm glad you're here. Not just here today, here, still here. He nodded once, looked away. Composed himself with the swiftness of a man with decades of practice at it. Good casserole last time, he said. Is Pete making another one? He made pies this time. What kind of apple cherry, and something he calls a Montana special and refuses to explain. I'm concerned about the Montana special. Same, she said. Want some coffee? Yeah, Jack said. I do. And they went to join the rest of the room. The conversation that happened between Pete Garfield and Jack Callahan that afternoon was one Emily would ask about later, and Pete would only partially describe with the particular evasiveness of old men who have said something real to each other and consider it private. What she knew was that at some point in the early afternoon, she looked across the kitchen and saw them sitting at the far end of the table with coffee cups and the remnants of the Montana special pie, talking in the low even tones of two people who have found a shared frequency. And Pete had his hand flat on the table the way he did when he was making a point he cared about, and Jack was listening with his full attention in the way she'd seen him listen to things that mattered. She didn't interrupt. She went back to her conversation with Karen Whitmore. Karen had been talking to Roy for the better part of an hour, and what Roy had given her patiently with the steady eye of a man who understood that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is be a wall that something important can be set against was information. About the investigation, about what Dennis Howell had found, about where the Whitmore case stood, and what the next steps looked like, and what the realistic timeline was for a woman who had been waiting 3 years for justice she deserved. Karen came to find Emily when Roy was done, and she sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of conversation. Roy told me about the timeline, Karen said finally. I know it's long, Emily said. I know that's hard. It is. Karen folded her hands on the table. But it's a timeline. That's different from what I had before, which was nothing. She looked at Emily directly. Before you, there was nothing. Do you understand what I mean by that? Not slow, not difficult. Nothing. A wall. And now there's a timeline. It's not enough, Emily said. No, Karen agreed. It's not enough. But it's something, and something is so much more than nothing that I don't have words for the distance between them. She paused. Carl would have liked you. He was a stubborn man, not foolishly stubborn, principled stubborn. The kind that holds the line not because it can't see the cost, but because it can and decides the line is worth it anyway. She studied Emily's face. You have that. I've been called stubborn before, Emily said. By who? Mostly by myself. Karen smiled. It was the first full smile Emily had seen from her, and it changed her face completely. Took 20 years off, it revealed the woman underneath the careful composure. Then you've been paying attention, Karen said, Mom. The twist came at 3 in the afternoon, and it came in the form of Dennis Howell. He wasn't expected. He hadn't been invited because Emily hadn't known he was in the area. But Roy's phone had buzzed at 2:30, and Roy had gone quiet and then come to find Emily in the kitchen with the particular expression that meant something had happened. Howell's 20 minutes out, Roy said. He says it's important. Good important or bad important? Roy looked at her steadily. He said to tell you he wouldn't drive out here on a Saturday unless it was worth it. Howell arrived at 3:02 still in his good coat, which meant he'd come from somewhere formal rather than from home. And he had the focused energy of a man who had been sitting on something since morning and was finally in the right place to put it down. The room went quiet when he came in. Not the sudden dropped silence of alarm, the gathering quiet of people who understand that something significant is arriving. Howell looked around the room, at Roy, at Jack, at Karen Whitmore, whose presence visibly registered with him a quick recalibration in his expression. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I didn't know you'd be here." "Is that a problem?" Karen asked. Her voice was entirely even. "No," Howell said, and something in his posture shifted. "Actually, it might be the right thing. What I have to say concerns you directly." He sat down at the kitchen table. Emily sat across from him. Jack settled into the chair beside her without being asked. Karen sat on Emily's other side. Roy stood. Pete Garfield, who had no legal stake in any of this and was here purely as family, pulled his chair 3 inches closer in the particular way of someone who intends to hear every word. "Gerald Briggs surrendered his passport this morning," Howell said. The kitchen was absolutely silent. "I was notified yesterday evening that the state investigation had reached the point where formal charges were being prepared." Howell continued. His attorney Garner, the one from Billings, attempted to negotiate a delay in the surrender pending a review. The state declined. He paused. At 9:45 this morning, Gerald Briggs appeared with counsel at the State Attorney General's regional office and surrendered his passport. He is formally under investigation for fraud, criminal intimidation, and obstruction of justice. He looked at Karen, and he said formal inquiry into the circumstances of Carl Whitmore's death has been reopened at the state level. The county sheriff's involvement with Briggs has been referred to the state ethics board. Karen Whitmore's hands folded on the table did not move, but something moved through her face, something enormous. Carefully contained the expression of a woman who has been holding a very heavy thing in very still hands for a very long time and has just been told it's all right to set it down. "Reopen," she said. The word was barely sound. "With new evidence and state-level jurisdiction," Howell said. "It will be thorough, Mrs. Whitmore. I won't promise you an outcome I can't guarantee, but I will promise you it will be thorough." Karen nodded, once. Her jaw was tight. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Pete Garfield, who was 73 years old and had lived in the Cutters Creek Valley his entire life and had watched Gerald Briggs buy his way into the machinery of it piece by piece over 20 years, put both hands flat on the table and exhaled a breath that seemed to have been waiting a long time to be let go. "About time," he said, and the kitchen breathed again. Later, much later, when the pies were gone and the coffee cups had been refilled twice, and the winter dark had come down completely outside, Emily found herself on the porch alone for the first time all day. Not because she needed to be alone. That was the thing she kept noticing, the thing that kept surprising her in small increments. She didn't need to be alone anymore, the way she had needed it before, the way solitude had once been not a preference, but a survival mechanism. She was on the porch because she wanted a moment which was different, a moment to be still inside all of this and feel the shape of it. The investigation was real. Karen Whitmore was inside her house drinking coffee with Roy Decker and Dennis Howell. Pete Garfield was teaching Jack how to properly eat apple pie, which apparently Jack had been doing wrong his entire life, according to Pete's very specific theory about pie eating technique, and the argument had been going for 20 minutes and showed no signs of resolution. Her land was hers. She said it to herself quietly, the way you say something to make it real. Your land is yours. The ground under her feet, the cabin her grandfather built and her father improved and she had fought to keep. The birch tree out past the east fence that her father had planted the year she was born, which was dormant now in the January cold, but would come back in the spring because birch trees always came back. The door opened behind her. Jack came out. He had 2 coffee cups, one of which he held out to her without preamble, and she took it and they stood next to each other on the porch in the cold for a moment without talking, which had become one of her favorite things about Jack Callahan. He had learned when talking was useful and when it wasn't, and he'd learned specifically when silence with her was a different thing than silence against her. "Big day," he said finally. "Big day," she agreed. "How does it feel?" She thought about it. She owed him the real answer, not the convenient one. "Like the beginning of something," she said. "Not the end. I thought it would feel like the end, but it feels like the beginning." Because it is, he said, the end of the bad thing, the beginning of. He gestured vaguely with his coffee cup at the dark and the cold and the light from the windows of her cabin, where 15 people were talking and arguing about pie. This, she nodded slowly. Can I tell you something, she said. Always. The morning of my birthday, the morning before I found you. She paused. I gave myself 30 seconds to feel sorry for myself. That was the rule. I had 30 seconds and then get back to work. Because feeling things was a luxury I couldn't afford. And now, he said. Now I think that was wrong, she said. Not wrong to get back to work, but wrong about what feeling things costs. She held the coffee cup in both hands. I thought letting things matter was a weakness. I thought needing people was a liability. I thought. She stopped, started again. I thought my father's lesson was about being strong enough to help people without needing help yourself. But I don't think that's what he meant at all. Jack was very still. I think he meant that helping people is what connects you to them, she said. That when you reach out, when you carry someone, or when you let someone carry you, you're not losing something, you're building something. And I had been so busy protecting myself from loss that I didn't notice I was also protecting myself from that. She looked out into the dark. He wouldn't have wanted that for me, my dad. He wouldn't have wanted the cabin and the land and the list on the counter and nothing else. No, Jack said quietly. He wouldn't have. He would have wanted this, she said. The porch argument about pie. Karen Whitmore in the kitchen. You here. She paused. Especially you here. Jack looked at her, in the light coming through the window. His face was open in a way she'd seen it be only a handful of times, the unguarded version, the one that existed before he assembled whatever he showed the world. Emily Carter, he said. Jack Callahan. For the record, he said carefully, the day on that mountain road, I know you did it because of your father and because it was right and because that's who you are. I know it wasn't about me specifically. It wasn't, she agreed. But I want you to know, he said, that the reason I'm standing on your porch right now is about you specifically. Not the story, not the 3 miles. You. He paused. Whatever this is, whatever it turns into, I want to be clear about that. She looked at him for a long moment. The cold pressed in around them, and through the window came the sound of Pete's voice raised in final authority on the subject of pie eating and Roy's laugh and the particular warmth of a room full of people who had found each other through the strangest possible route and were now improbably completely at home. I know, she said. I want you to know it's mutual. He nodded, looked forward into the dark. Good, he said. Good, she agreed. They stood there for a while longer, side by side on the porch of her father's cabin in the January cold, and it was not comfortable exactly. It was Montana in January. It was never comfortable, but it was the kind of discomfort that you choose because of what's on the other side of it is worth it. The door burst open behind them. Both of you get in here, Pete said. Jack, I'm not done proving my point about the pie. You haven't proven anything, Jack said. I've proven plenty, Emily, tell him. I'm not getting involved in the pie argument, Emily said. You live here, you have an obligation to have an opinion about pie. Pete said with the total conviction of a man who genuinely believed this. Come inside before you both freeze. Jack looked at Emily. She looked at Jack. Something passed between them that was not quite a smile on either side, but came from the same place smiles come from. They went inside. The weeks that followed moved differently than any weeks Emily could remember. Not slower, not quieter. Differently the way time moves when you are present in it rather than bracing against it. Gerald Briggs's formal charges were filed in late January. The list was longer than the initial announcement had suggested. The fraud counts alone numbered 9, spanning 3 counties in a decade of deliberate manipulation. Franklin Souza resigned from his law practice the week the charges became public. The county sheriff announced he would not seek re-election. The second planning commissioner, who had refused to issue a statement for Briggs, gave an interview to Sandra Cho that ran in the state paper and was picked up by 2 national outlets. Sheila Prentice, the county clerk, who had been sitting on her discomfort for 18 months waiting for someone to ask the right question, was formally commended by the state attorney general's office for her cooperation. The Carl Whitmore investigation moved slowly, the way serious investigations move, but it moved. Karen called Emily every Tuesday, not with updates necessarily, but just to talk, and those calls became something Emily looked forward to in a way that surprised her. The specific warmth of a woman who had found in Karen's voice something she hadn't realized she'd been missing since her mother. Sandra chose full feature on Emily the complete story from the mountain road to the investigation to the signed agreement ran in late February and was read by enough people in enough places that Emily's phone rang for 3 days with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. She answered almost none of them, not because she was hiding, but because she was working. The list on the kitchen counter had gotten shorter, and she intended to keep shortening it, and the compensatory payment from the Briggs settlement had made things possible that had not been possible for 2 years. She had the east fence fully replaced. She had the generator properly serviced by an actual professional. So for the first time since her father had handled those things himself, she had the heating system looked at and a part replaced that the technician told her had been failing for at least 2 winters, which explained things she'd been managing with extra sweaters. She also planted a new birch tree in the spring. Not near the old one, that one was her father's, and she wasn't trying to replicate it. The new one went on the north end of the property in a spot she'd always liked, a spot that got morning light and afternoon shade and was, she'd calculated, visible from the porch if you stood on the right side of it. Jack came out on the day she planted it. He was not on crutches anymore. He walked with the slight favoring of the leg that was diminishing and would probably be gone by summer. And he had the look he got when he was somewhere he intended to be settled, present, not performing any version of himself for anyone. He watched her dig for a while before he said anything. "That's a lot of hole for a small tree," he said. "The roots need space," she said. "If you give them space at the beginning, they'll hold in anything." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that a metaphor?" "It's a tree planting technique," she said. "But sure, it can also be a metaphor." He crouched down carefully because of the leg and looked at the young birch, maybe 3 feet tall, pale bark, particular trembling quality of birch leaves even in light wind. "What's this one for?" he said. She sat back on her heels, thought about it. "Everything forward," she said. He looked at her. "My father's tree is his," she said. "This one is for whatever comes next." Jack nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else. He picked up the second shovel she'd left leaning against the fence post and started filling in around the roots, and they worked in comfortable silence for a while, the two of them, until the tree was planted and the ground was tamped down and the birch stood in its new place with the morning light on it. Roy had called it right, Emily thought. Jack had called it right. Pete had called it right in his quiet way, arriving with casseroles and pieces and the unspoken insistence of an old man who had decided she was his to look after, now, and didn't intend to negotiate the point. What had changed was not just the land, not just the legal victory, not just Gerald Briggs's passport sitting in a government office while his lawyers worked through the implications of 9 fraud counts. What had changed was Emily herself, the interior geography of her, the arrangement of the furniture as she'd put it to Jack on that January porch. She had spent 20 years, all 20 of them, but especially the last 2, in a kind of voluntary constriction, protecting herself from needing things, from expecting people to show up, from the vulnerability of wanting something she didn't fully control. She had turned her father's lesson into armor instead of into what it actually was, which was an invitation. An invitation to reach toward other people, to help and be helped and build something out of both. She understood that now. She had understood it the moment Jack Callahan's grip on her wrist in the truck outside the service station had said, "I see you," without using those words. She had understood it more fully every day since, each day adding another layer, another dimension, until the understanding was not intellectual but physical. She could feel it in the way she moved through the cabin, in the way she picked up the phone without rehearsing what she was going to say, in the way she left the door unlocked. The 3-mile angel, they called her. She had heard it first from Roy, who said it without sentimentality. Just a statement of what the chapter had decided, and it had embarrassed her deeply, and then slowly she had found a way to carry it. Not because she was an angel. She was not an angel. She was a 20-year-old woman who had made a decision on a mountain road because she had been raised by a man who believed that what you did for strangers in the dark was the truest measure of who you were. But if the name meant something to them, if it held the memory of what had happened and what had come from it, the investigation and Karen Whitmore and the 67 bikes in her drive and Pete's pies and the birch tree going into the ground on a spring morning, then she would carry it. She would carry it the same way she had carried Jack Callahan up that embankment, one step at a time, without stopping, until she reached the place she was going. Jack smoothed the last of the soil around the tree's base and stood up. "It'll grow," he said. "Yes," Emily said, "it will." She looked at the birch, small, pale, trembling, slightly in the morning air. Roots buried in the ground her family had owned for 3 generations and would own for 3 more. She thought of her father on his fence line in the morning. She thought of her mother at the kitchen window. She thought of a mountain road in November, and a crash in the dark, and a choice she had made so fast she barely knew she was making it, a choice that turned out to be the first step of the longest 3 miles of her life and the most important. She thought this is what he meant. Not strength, not solitude, not the armor of needing no one. This the birch tree going in and the man standing beside her and the porch light still on because people were coming for dinner, and the door was unlocked because they were welcome. This was what Robert Carter had been teaching her every single day of her life without once using these exact words, because he was a quiet man, and quiet men teach with their hands and their choices and the way they show up for strangers on the side of the road without being asked. Emily Carter stood in the morning light of her father's land, and she understood, finally and completely, and in a way that would not leave her, that courage does not come from strength alone. It comes from the willingness to reach for something another person. The truth, a young birch tree going into cold ground, and hold on even when your hands are shaking, even when you don't know how the story ends. She had reached, she had held on, and everything she had now, every person, every repaired thing, every morning with coffee and a shorter list and a door left unlocked, was what grew from that. She picked up her shovel. Jack picked up his. And they walked back toward the cabin together, where the door was open and the light was on, and the people who had become her family were already waiting.